Mm. Okay, hi, this is Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto with a friend of mine who's not in Toronto. He's in Basel, Switzerland, which I've never been to. I've been to some of the other cities in Switzerland, but not where you are. It looks like you've got some really interesting old documents up behind you. So we'll have a chat about his activities. This is Alyn Ware, who is a New Zealander. And you'll tell a little bit when he starts speaking. He sounds to me like a Kiwi. Still, or maybe you're getting over that with an accent from Prague next, I expect. Anyway, I've known Alyn a little bit for a long time. He's been engaged. He's a real fire-eating activist who certainly is out there stirring everything up that he can get his hands on. To bring about nuclear disarmament. That's his middle name, nuclear disarmament. So I've run into him on a number of occasions, and he's always been a terrific speaker and a very, very lively friend. So here he is in Basel, Switzerland, where I understand he is somehow connected with, or maybe runs, the Basel Peace Office. And he's very engaged with the, I don't know what his role is, as director or something of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Disarmament, which is a worldwide organization of members of parliament who believe that it'd be a good thing to get rid of nuclear weapons. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Say hi.
Hello, or kia ora is what we say from New Zealand, meaning
really?
Celebrate life. That's our greeting.
Celebrate life. How lovely. It's great to hear your greetings in Maori, is it?
That's correct.
Very good. I have another friend who speaks Maori a little bit. Have you met Joanna yet? Joanna Santa Barbara?
Yeah.
Oh, good. She's learning Maori. Good. All right. So let's get right to work. I didn't know whether to try to track you down in Basel, where I think you are part of the time, or in Prague, where I think you're also spending a lot of time lately, or maybe in Geneva, where you hang out when there's something going on at the United Nations, or maybe in Vienna, where there are other things that may be of interest to you, or maybe in New York City, where, again, when there's a UN event, you tend to go there. So it was good to find out where you are at this particular moment. Hi, and thank you for being with me and giving us a little time.
Thank you, Metta.
Yeah, looks like you have a program. You sent me something about the kind of an event that you have organized for tomorrow or today, and it looks very, very interesting. Why don't I just let you start however you want and tell us what you're up to, what organizations you are running, and what this event is that you're coordinating for, or you're involved with anyway, in Basel today and tomorrow.
Thanks, Metta. So as you say, I come from New Zealand, where I was very involved in the campaign to prohibit nuclear weapons from our country. We used to accept nuclear weapons on warships from the United States, France, the UK, and we did a campaign to abolish them. So they're no longer allowed in our country. And we also were very engaged in making the South Pacific a nuclear weapon-free zone. And a lot of my passion for this came from seeing the impact of nuclear testing in the region from the big powers. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, all tested nuclear weapons in the Pacific, and the horrific impact that had, particularly on women and children from the radiation. To me, that shows that the nuclear arms race is not just something that might destroy civilization, it's already killing people, and it's having an impact across countless generations, because the radiation has that impact and the genetic damage has that impact. So we banned them in New Zealand. We've basically banned them in the South Pacific. Most of the rest of the Southern Hemisphere is now part of nuclear weapon-free zones, but the Northern Hemisphere still has these horrific weapons. So that's why a few years ago I moved over to Basel in Switzerland. And why Basel? Is because it's a very unique place. It's right on the border of three countries. Switzerland, a non-nuclear state, Germany, a state which hosts nuclear weapons, part of a nuclear alliance, and France, a nuclear weapons state. So basically, we're right here in the intersection of the different frameworks around nuclear weapons. Now, most of the countries of the world have foregone nuclear weapons. The majority say there's no sense of having them for our security. So Switzerland is, one of those countries. But there's a big group that rely on nuclear weapons. That's all of the NATO countries. They may not own them, but they rely on nuclear deterrence. And then you've got a smaller group, 9 countries, which actually produce nuclear weapons themselves. So to get to a nuclear weapons-free world, we have to build on the strength of the non-nuclear states, and we have to engage with the nuclear armed and the allies to try and persuade them that they no longer require these weapons. So again, Basel is a great place because it's very close to the European Parliament, to the European Court of Human Rights, to Geneva, where different things are happening, and also to some of the European capitals. So we have a program that's based on European security, based in Basel, and we're focusing on common security. The answer to conflicts with countries, whether it's with Russia or with Syria or Iran or whatever countries the conflicts are, the answer is not to build up greater threats of destroying each other with weapons. It's try and resolving those conflicts through common security mechanisms. That's like using international law, using diplomacy, using mediation, using the courts. We have these mechanisms. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is one such mechanism. And it includes US and Canada, the European countries, Russia, and all the former Soviet countries. So it's a great forum to bring these countries together to try and nut out these issues. And that's what we're elevating in Basel, is to focus on these. When there's a problem, don't focus on
focus on the OSCE.
OSCE is very strong.
And do they have an office? When I was involved with Helsinki Citizens Assembly, we were sort of viewing the OSCE was going to be the governance mechanism to look forward to at the end of the Cold War.
Yep.
And I don't think it happened. As a matter of fact, I don't think they even had an office. Do they have one now? And if so, where is it?
Oh, yes. So there's an office in Copenhagen, Denmark. That's the headquarters. And then the presidency rotates every 2 years. So I think it's Slovakia or Hungary that has a presidency at the moment. It was Austria before that. Switzerland had the presidency for a couple of years and did very well. Under the Swiss presidency of the OSCE, they negotiated the Minsk agreements, which were the agreements that helped manage the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which had all the potential of flaring up into a full-scale war. Yes. It hasn't been resolved yet. We've still got the conflict there, but it hasn't flared up into a war yet. But, your surprise at the OSCE is quite natural because it's not highlighted in the media. It's not at the tip of the politicians' tongues. Generally, when they think about security, they think about military security. And therefore, do we need to put more money into NATO? Do we need more forces in NATO? Should NATO be doing military exercises? This is the wrong response to the conflicts that we're having. It should be, how do we resolve these issues? And that's where we need to put more emphasis on the OSCE, but also on the United Nations. And, we have the United Nations in Geneva, which is where most of the negotiations happen. So the negotiations for the Iran deal, for example, it was basically in Geneva and close by, Lausanne, which is close by to Geneva. Other negotiations for Syria, happening there. Again, not enough political support and financial support is given to the United Nations and to the OSCE. They do a really good job, but they're strapped because they have very little support. So, the United Nations annual budget is 5.5 billion, which is about the same as the annual budget for the New York police force.
Yeah.
Compare that to
one good bomber will.
Yeah, right. Compare that to the weapons, arms industry and military, 1.7 trillion per year. Is on the world.
Compare that to the amount it would take to do the Sustainable Development Goals, 1.4 trillion, per year. So you have pocket change after even taking care of the Sustainable Development Goals. If you just converted all this military things, it's such an important proposal. Yeah.
So that's why we're working on the political side, which is negotiation, mediation, diplomacy, common security mechanisms, but we're also looking at the money issue because one of the key reasons there's so much money going into the military is because corporations that are manufacturing the weapons are making so much money, and so they are lobbying US Congress or Parliament in the UK, or the government in France, where there's not quite so much control in the Parliament. The corporations are running the show to a large degree because of the amount of money it is. So that's why it's not just a political process, it's a financial process. How do we deal with this? How do we shift the playing field? And one of the ways of doing that is through lobbying in the governments. So we've got, for example, in the US, we have our co-president of our network of parliamentarians in the US is Senator Ed Markey. And he's got a bill called the SANE bill, Smarter Approach to Nuclear Expenditure. And it's not that ambitious. It doesn't say cut the nuclear weapons spending altogether. It basically says cut it by a third, which would still make the US the biggest spender on nuclear weapons in the world. But with that third, you'd have a huge amount of money, $20 billion additional a year to put into renewable energy sustainable development. Is
he talking about cutting the modernization budget that they're planning on, or the maintenance, current budget? I mean, I don't know how much they spend as just ordinary maintaining the arsenals, and how much is this additional 1 point something trillion that's going to be spent over the next, 30 years or 20 years?
Yeah.
Saving.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the problem is that Senator Markey can't even get all the Democrats in the Senate to sign on, because so many of them are supported by the weapons industry. So to help that, we're also doing something called divestment. And divestment is, these corporations are public corporations. They have shares on the stock market. And all around the world, there are people investing in them. And these include governments, sovereign wealth funds, which are owned by governments, pension funds, which are often owned by governments, cities, universities. So we're encouraging all of them to say, stop investing in these nuclear weapons corporations. So that's part of what this is. Move the nuclear.
Oh, what a nice poster. Move the nuclear weapons money. Beautiful.
This is at the top there is what the nuclear weapons budget is over the next 10 years, $1 trillion. And here is what it could be spent on instead. Renewable energies, development, jobs, health, education. And then on the back is sort of like ideas on how you can do it, even if you're not in a nuclear weapons state. You can call on your university or your pension fund or your government to stop investing in nuclear weapons. And already we've had success. We've got 4 governments have done this, and this has come through our parliamentarians.
Really? Which 4 governments?
So the 4 governments are New Zealand, that's my government, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Norway have adopted official policies not to have any of their public funds, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, investing in nuclear weapons. And so we're also working at other levels. We're going to encourage more governments to do this. And with this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, that a number of non-nuclear governments are signing on to, we're now going to those ones who sign on and say, okay, you've signed on to the treaty. Have you checked whether your public funds are investing in nuclear weapons corporations? And if they are, you should adopt policy to stop that investment. So,
hooray for you! That is, I think that's the most promising thing I've heard all week.
Yeah. And then in the nuclear arms states, we can't get nuclear arms states to stop, investing public funds because that's part of their policy yet. But we can get at the sub-level. So, in Germany is still under the nuclear umbrella, but they've got states and they've got cities. There are 16 regional states in Germany, and already 5 of them have divested from nuclear weapons corporations.
Oh, okay. Now that's a new angle. Lately I've been coming more and more across people who are saying, don't just work at the federal level or the national level, work at your municipal level or your provincial level. And of course, I think about 2 months ago, Jerry Brown, before he finished his term, held a conference in San Francisco
Mhm.
about using subnational
Yep.
governments
Yes.
in various, especially I think for climate change, but there are all kinds of things. And I see these as all one package, because you really can't, I don't think you can get rid of, climate change without using money that we need to divert from something like the military and so on. So to my mind, this is just one big system that we have
Yeah.
to change the whole thing.
Yeah.
That's
And
great.
that's why we're cooperating with 350.org, which has been leading the divestment from fossil fuel. So I'm working very closely with Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org.
Excellent.
And the ones in Germany that I mentioned, the way we managed to get enough traction to get divestment at the German state level was because we were cooperating with the Fossil Fuel Germany campaign. And there are a lot of young people are really inspired about the fossil fuel divestment. And then we said, well, if you're going to ask the state to stop funding, investing in fossil fuels, why don't you also ask them to stop investing in the weapons industry? Or if they can't do that, at least the nuclear weapons industry. So that cooperation is really successful so far. I mean, we've only started it. It's going to build it even more. And I think you're quite correct. The issues are linked, and the way of dealing with the issues through divesting is so important, because for both issues, the nuclear arms race and climate destruction, huge companies have got vested interests in the status quo, and they are preventing the progress. So we have to deal with those corporations, and divestment is the way to do it.
We had in Peace Magazine, we had an article, I think, that Aaron Hunt wrote for us a couple of issues ago about Don't Bank on the Bomb, which I think is, they're not, the people running that, I think I don't know what all they're doing, but besides or instead of focusing on corporations as such, they seem to be going to banks and finding which banks, they have a list of the Canadian banks that have the largest investments in military things. Military, but maybe also just nuclear. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, they're doing nuclear.
It has to be nuclear. Yeah.
Yeah, and so these are complementary campaigns, because they're working on the banks, which is very good. We're working on city funds, university funds, government funds. And that's what we have got a capacity to do, because we've got a global network of parliamentarians who can advance these policies at the federal level.
No, wait a minute. You are the PNND man, but
network of parliamentarians.
You say you have this global network of parliamentarians. Is that the organization that's coordinating this campaign, or is it some other one of your hats that you're wearing?
It's a partnership. So Move the Nuclear Weapons Money is a partnership of the World Future Council, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation, Disarmament, Global Security Institute, and a number of others.
And you wear lots of hats. And I know you're connected with the World Futures Council, which I don't know much about. Yep. Not to divert you from this fascinating topic, but maybe you can say a little bit about what that is, the World Future Council, since I don't know.
Yeah, the World Future Council is a coalition of 50 very successful policymakers, whether either parliamentarians or government policymakers, and who have been working on issues to ensure that we have a sustainable future. And that's on climate protection, environmental protection, sustainable finance, peace, and disarmament. Just an example, one of our council members is the president of the United Nations General Assembly, the former...
Who's that this year?
Maria Espinosa, the former foreign minister of Ecuador.
I see.
Who before that, when she was the foreign minister, she was working on bringing corporate accountability to human rights law through the United Nations process. So this is some of the areas that they're working on. Well, Future Council was a pioneer of the feed-in tariffs, which was the way of equaling the playing field for renewable energies and fossil fuels, because in the beginning, fossil fuels had a barrier because they couldn't have continuous production of their energy. For wind turbines, you produce it when it's windy, but when it's not windy, you can't produce. And the grid where you feed the energy into was penalizing them. Basically, well, if you can't deliver constantly, then we're going to pay you a lower price for the energy. And what the feed-in tariff was a way of equalizing the selling price for the electricity, which meant that fossil fuels became competitive renewable energies became competitive with fossil fuels.
Uh-huh.
So that's one thing that the World Future Council pioneered. There are a number of other things also.
Wonderful. Well, I hope there's certainly a future for that too, because I think it was just last week that I interviewed Adam Kuniaszewski, who's with something called the Bridge Foundation, and used to be the Chief Operating Officer of Green Cross International, and he was in Katowice, and he said that his project now is working on combating the what do you call it, the when they give support, what's the word for it, to the fossil fuel industry, subsidies. And he said there's $5 trillion a year in subsidies to fossil fuel industries. I made him say it about twice because I think, are you sure? And he said, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, working. Okay.
And so what, at Katowice, for the COP24, is it, or 25? 24. The World Future Council was there, and they launched the Global Renewables Congress, which is a congress of parliamentarians in order to promote renewable energies. And they're doing it in cooperation with IRENA, the International Renewable Energies Agency, which provides technical support for the development of renewable energies and policy advice also for governments. So together that's creating the positive, it's possible to replace all the fossil fuels with renewables. And both of those, World Future Council and IRENA together, demonstrate that that's possible and are helping governments to do that.
Okay, well, it looks like we're just going to have a whole flip over of the entire world economy tomorrow, and you've got it under control.
This also, which I want to show you.
That.
This is what we're doing on Monday.
I guess I can guess what that is. That's 1 million euros, right?
That's correct.
And you have in the thing you sent me that you're going to be, what are you counting out?
Yep.
What is it you're going to do? Because I want to watch this when it's going on.
So what we're going to focus on Monday is European weapons exports.
Yes.
It's not the whole military budget. That's even too huge. But just the weapons exports from European countries is $27 billion per year. 27 billion.
Yeah.
That's exports of weapons. Now, a lot of these weapons are going to places like Syria and Saudi Arabia and human rights violating countries in armed conflicts, to some of the corrupt governments in some of the African countries where they shouldn't be spending this money on weapons. They should be spending it on clean water and education and women's health, which is so important, children's health. But again, the weapons corporations, are influencing elections, etc., even in Latin American and African countries, etc. So, and a lot of Europeans don't even know this. So what we're going to do is we've got 27,000 of these. And on Monday, we're going to count them out. 1 million, 2 million, 3 million.
How many people do you need to be able to count 27,000?
27,000. It'll take us 5 hours to count out. But as we're counting, we'll have, okay, here's 100 million or 500 million. Let's put this over to Sustainable Development Goal 3 or Sustainable Development Goal 5, so that people can see that the money stacking up to help fund Sustainable Development Goals from the weapons money.
Wonderful. Yeah. Alyn, I don't want to interrupt you because this whole thing of this diversion of money to other sources is very, very much on my mind. And I don't know whether you realize that this talk show that we're doing right now is part of another larger project called Project Save the World, which our game is to identify, and we've found 6 global threats that could, in short order, wipe out 1 billion people or so. And so one of the things I'm thinking is that the militarism component, that is war and weapons, is the only one that could actually materially reduce the risk of all 5 of the other global threats. That is global warming, famine, pandemics, massive radiation exposure from something like Fukushima or Chernobyl or something, and cyber attacks. All of those are connected and interdependent, and the money and the well, it's not just money, because I mean these weapons actually emit, producing and running these tanks around and so on, actually of course emits CO2 and actually directly contributes not only to the production of greenhouse gases, but also to famine and pandemics. Famine is now a weapon of war mostly, and pandemics, you know how that goes, etc. You know, all of these things are connected, and the idea of diverting money to sustainable development goals, that's a pretty good way of putting it, that it would actually work on reducing all of these other threats. So, boy, are we ever partners. Thank you.
Well, yeah. And we're actually doing, as well as the money counting, we're doing a forum on invest in peace and sustainability. So,
all right. Does this tell people where they can find good, secure, or reasonably profitable places that they can put their money, or not? Because, you know, apparently, if you really want to do ethical investment, you have to think pretty hard about it. It's not easy. You know, you have to know what you're doing, because it's not always
so
easy.
It's both. It's like what you don't invest in, and then how to invest. And how to invest there's a number of aspects of that. One is like investing in good corporations, ones who follow the UN Global Compact, for example, and make sure, because there's a UN Global Compact on corporate behavior and financing, and that is involved in to ensure that the corporations are not destroying the environment and are not violating human rights law, those sorts of things. So there is now more mechanisms for checking whether, you know, the investments are fitting that. It's true, it's not, it's still a bit more complicated than the divestment side. The divestment side is quite easy. There's 25 corporations basically that are involved in manufacturing nuclear weapons and their delivery systems to, you know, a reasonable amount. So
send me the list. I want to print it in Peace Magazine. Everybody.
Yeah, we have the list on. We have the list on the website. Move the Nuclear Weapons Money. Just go at the top of corporations. So it's quite easy to look at your investment portfolio and make sure you're not investing in those. The other part, you know, checking are your investments good ones. That takes a little bit more work, but there's a lot more support. There are a lot more networks and organizations. So there is in the US, there are a couple of lists of like what are reasonable corporations, you know, that you can invest in. And we also will have those up on our website next week.
We need one for Canada.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Maybe there is one, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's becoming easier now. It's becoming easier because more, not just people, but more entities, more funds, whether they are government funds or pension funds, are being pushed by their constituents to have ethical investment policies, which means they have to do more monitoring of this. So we're going to have, for example, at our event, at this event here, we've got a pension fund manager who's going to talk about how they determine their investment strategy, and because they are an ethical investment pension fund. So it'll give, you know, people more ideas about how to do it.
You know, there are people that I used to hear about who would go to the annual general meeting of a corporation, and because they owned a small amount of stock, theoretically they're allowed to speak, and they get up and raise hell, you know, against whatever it is they're complaining about. There are other times I've seen people, especially against mining companies. We've got a lot of mining companies in Canada, and they don't behave very well. And so there are people who picket and hold banners outside these things and so on. Has anybody, in connection with this divestment program, is there any program of people who are trying to go to meetings so they can stand up and say, our company should not be doing these things?
Yeah, I'm not personally involved in that so much because I'm focusing a little bit more with our network of parliamentarians on building good policies and getting better government accountability and building government incentives for ethical investment, getting governments to sign on to the UN Compact, for example. So I'm not personally as involved in those types of actions, but I know that there are some who do that.
Now, this compact, I'm embarrassed to say this, I don't know anything about it, except if I'm thinking back, I believe that Kofi Annan, was he the one who started that? I think when he was in power in New York, as if there's power at the UN, I'm not sure how much power there is for the Secretary General, but at any rate, I think he was talking about trying to develop some better understanding among businesses about environmental and other social issues. Is that what came out of that? And what is the compact, and what if a company wants to sign on to it? What do they promise to do?
So the UN Compact is voluntary, but it lists 10 principles that those who become members are to try and uphold. And so those principles include adherence to Declaration of Human Rights, the International Labour Organization's Declaration on Fundamental Principles of Work rights, the Rio Declaration on the Environment, and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Those are the key documents out of which the 10 principles arise. As I mentioned, it's voluntary because they haven't managed to get it to come in, try and get this through the Security Council. It's not going to work because, the P5 and the Security Council tend to be siding more with their corporate friends than they do, with those who are pushing for progressive social change. But there's still, so members can be governments, or they can be other entities, can be cities can sign on, can be corporations can sign on. So it's sort of, all encompassing in a sense in that way. And I think you're right. I think it did happen through the time of Kofi Annan. I think prior to that, Boutros Ghali was trying a different approach on financing, and that was to try and strengthen the financing of the United Nations. You may remember this. And to have independent financing for the United Nations, because the United Nations is strapped by the fact that it has a very low budget and that the most powerful countries will not allow the budget to increase. In fact, they are always calling for a reduction in the UN budget. And Boutros Ghali proposed that there be independent financing for the United Nations, but of course it was opposed by the powerful countries because that would give the United Nations more power. So that's when I think Kofi Annan came in and goes, well, if we can't deal with it that way, here's another way. If we can't build up financial resources for the United Nations to make us do better, let's work with funds and try and get them to work more ethically. And that's where the UN Compact has come from.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I mentioned, when Norway, for example, Norway pension fund, which is huge, multi-billion-dollar fund, decided to divest from unethical enterprises, they used the UN Compact as the guide because they were a member of the UN Compact.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In terms of your program tomorrow, you've got a bunch of people coming. What is the idea? You're bringing people together in Basel. Is this something you do a lot, or does it just happen that tomorrow is the one day of the year when you're doing something like this?
Well, we have a few things happening. One is we're working in cooperation with Swiss Peace, which has been working, a lot more on conflict prevention and conflict transformation. And so they're very good on that level. They haven't really been linking much with disarmament, but they saw, as you've seen, how important disarmament and demilitarization is. So they've brought us in as like a partner to focus on those aspects. So we're in a partnership there. Mm-hmm. We're also bringing PND, our network of parliamentarians, together with Mayors for Peace. So Mayors for Peace is a network of over 7,000 cities around the world. They've got a lot of cities members in Europe, and we're bringing cooperation between the mayors and the parliamentarians, particularly in Europe. Again, to highlight what I mentioned right at the beginning, to highlight common security, which there are already a lot within the European system, not just the OSCE, but the European Court of Human Rights. There's a lot in the European system that provides for ways of solving problems and conflicts without recourse to war or the threat of war or further militarism. So we've got a fertile place to
Yes.
advance these ideas. But we need the cooperation, because often they're just working, in their own parliament or in their own city. So here we're bringing to help them work cooperatively throughout Europe, and also to work in cooperation with our partners in like the United States and in other places. So it's a European regional meeting of parliamentarians and city leaders is one of the things we're doing. Mm-hmm. And then we're bringing in some of the financial people to sort of show, the divestment from military and reinvestment in sustainable development and how that can work. So
now
that
the mayors, if the mayors were enthusiastic about the divestment program, they would be in a very good position to make some progress with that. Isn't that right? There are several thousand cities that are now part of that. Because I just had a conversation with Aaron Tovish, who had been very involved with Mayors for Peace for, I think, 13 years, but has been out for a couple of years. Who's running it now, and what is your connection with that organization? And isn't it a good organization to work on this divestment idea?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Mayors for Peace has about 7,000 cities around the world that are members. Of those, probably about 150 would be quite active. And others would be nominally active. And so one of the ones that's active is Basel. So the mayor of Basel is hosting this meeting to bring the mayors and parliamentarians together. And we have two vice presidents of Mayors for Peace coming. One is from Norway and one is from Germany. And then we have there's another executive city in Europe that's very, very active, Granola's in Spain. They're coming also. So we're actually building cooperation between the Mayors for Peace European network and PND, our network of parliamentarians. So PND, our network, has developed this Parliamentary Action Plan for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World.
All right.
There are many things that parliamentarians can do, and it varies. If you're a parliamentarian in a nuclear armed state, what you can do is different from, say, a parliamentarian in a non-nuclear state. There are some things that everybody can do, but some things that are directed to which country you're in. But we've distilled them down to 14 actions, and then our network of parliamentarians to choose which of those 14 actions are most relevant for them in their parliament.
All right, give me a hint.
Peace has done something similar. A Mayors for Peace plan for their mayors. We're going to be bringing these two together to show where we can do a lot more cooperation between the mayors and the parliamentarians. Okay.
Give me some examples of the things from that list of 14.
So, for nuclear weapon states, for example, a parliamentarian can work directly on the nuclear weapons budget. Ask questions in their parliament. What is the nuclear weapons budget? Challenge modernization of nuclear weapons, for example, call for reduction of the nuclear weapons budget. That's something you can do in a nuclear armed state. And we have our members, parliamentary members, do that in the UK, France, and the United States in particular, because they have very good parliamentary process there. If you're in a non-nuclear state, you can't really do that because your government's not spending money on nuclear weapons. But you can ask your government to ensure that it doesn't invest in nuclear weapons with the pension fund or their other funds. So that's different actions. If you're in a non-nuclear state, you could ask your government to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In a nuclear armed state or allied state, that's not going to go anywhere because none of them are going to sign this new treaty. But what's really important in the nuclear armed states and the allied states, like Canada, for example, is to move policy of no first use. Because at the moment, at least half the nuclear armed states, that's US, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, they have policies that they are open to the possibility of being the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. That's very, very risky. So we have to get them to say, we'll not launch a nuclear attack. We'll not be the first to use nuclear weapons. And that's what our parliamentarians in the nuclear armed states and the allied states should be pushing for as a step.
Well, you know what? That's exactly what I spent the most time talking to Aaron about, because that's one of the things that he's working on. And he gave me all the rationale for why I was asking him, isn't this kind of a diversion or distraction to talk about something as simple as no first use when the real goal is the TP&D, get them, TP&W, get them to sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And he said no, because they are really, they need each other. And so I said, well, what if Canada took some real initiative within NATO of calling for NATO to take a position of no first use? We're not apparently going to get Justin Trudeau to agree to sign the ban treaty, but maybe the next best thing would be to get him to take some stand inside NATO for no first use. Is that a realistic thing to try working on? And are there parliamentarians here in Canada who are already committed to working on that?
Yes and yes. Why is it realistic? Because under NATO, Canada and the other NATO members feel that they need some form of nuclear deterrence until there's a process for the global elimination. They know that the nuclear armed states are not going to join this ban treaty. They've all opposed it. But some of the nuclear armed states do agree with the elimination of nuclear weapons under a joint treaty, a nuclear weapons convention, which includes the other nuclear armed states. So they see there is a possibility, but that they're not doing that now. In order to get there, no first use is vital, because if you still hold on to the policy of first use of nuclear weapons, it means your idea of nuclear weapons is that they are to respond to conventional weapons. Mm-hmm. If they're only to respond to nuclear weapons, you don't need a first use policy. You'll say, if anyone uses nuclear weapons against us, we will use nuclear weapons against them. That's minimal deterrence. And if you got to that level, that all the nuclear armed states say that, we'll only use nuclear weapons against the nuclear weapons of another side, then they can negotiate to get rid of the nuclear weapons. As long as everyone's involved and you can verify, you can do it. But while you hold on to first use, it means you're also thinking about using your nuclear weapons against conventional weapons, which means you're never going to give up nuclear deterrence. Mm-hmm. So that's why no first use is the first step towards phasing out the reliance on nuclear deterrence. And unless you can imagine a process or put forward a process for reducing and eventually phasing out nuclear deterrence, you'll never join a nuclear prohibition treaty. So that's another part of the work that we're doing. Not just how do you phase out nuclear deterrence?
He made an interesting point that I hadn't thought of before. I mean, he said that, most people are not aware that their country, their nuclear, if they're in a nuclear country, that their policy is that they might, under certain conditions, use nuclear weapons first. Most people think that our position is we only have these for deterrence purposes. That is, if you hit us first, we'll be in a position to hit you back, second strike, retaliation. But that if people knew that their country was actually not even believing in deterrence, they were planning to maybe use the darn things, then there would be more pressure, I think, and he implied that there would be more agreement that we don't even want our country to be ready to use it, take the initiative and do the first strike. Yep. I think it may be that we just need to make more people aware of the fact that the whole theory of deterrence isn't really what's informing the policies of the nuclear countries. It's potential for aggression.
That's correct. Yeah. It's moved beyond MAD. MAD was mutually assured destruction, which is the idea of deterrence. It's moved to NUTS, nuclear use and tactics, which includes, the option of using nuclear weapons against conventional targets and other possibilities. And I think you're right. If people knew that, they would be more scared. They'd think this is crazy. Who would want to start a nuclear war? And they'd become more engaged. And the other question you asked is there support in Canada from our parliamentarians? And I say yes, from the different political parties. Yes. So we have parliamentarians from the New Democratic Party, but we also have Liberals who support this. Our Liberal leader in Canada is Hedy Fry, and she is the head of the Canadian parliamentary delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, I mentioned the OSCE includes the United States, Canada, European countries, and Russia, and the former Russian countries.
Yes.
And Hedy has led initiatives there to get all of these delegations, including the American and the Russian delegations, to agree to the idea of no first use. So it's now adopted in declarations of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and Hedy Fry has been one of the leaders in that.
Okay, now she's a liberal, right?
Yes, she's a liberal. Yes.
And how, I mean, the Liberal Party, it's very funny because the Liberal Party takes positions in their party platforms when they have a convention. You know, they took the position, we want to, you know, get rid of nuclear weapons. But then when push comes to shove, they don't actually, you know, they're in government. They could sign the damn ban treaty, and they don't. And they won't. So I wonder what kind of position a person is in within the Liberal Party if she goes around doing things that is a little bit beyond what they have intended to do.
Well, there's another aspect to this. As I mentioned, trying to get Canada to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, although it'd be a nice thing, is a much bigger ask than asking Canada to support no first use. And I know this from experience from my own country, New Zealand. You know, we went the full distance and prohibited nuclear weapons, and what happened? We got kicked out of ANZUS, the Australia, New Zealand, US treaty, by the United States. The United States says if you're totally, you know, against nuclear weapons and you won't even allow our ships into your harbours, then sorry, we can't do that type of military cooperation under ANZUS. So for a NATO country to go the full length and sign on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will quite likely lead to them being kicked out of NATO. Was NATO strategic concept still
required? About half of the peace movement in Canada wants to be kicked out of NATO, or if not kicked out, walk out. You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the plus side from New Zealand is that actually maybe our security is better since we're no longer in ANZUS. But this is not something I think that the Canadian Liberal government is going to advocate for, you know, leaving NATO. But they could push no first use within NATO. And in fact, could be quite influential if they did, because Canada has raised this in the past. When Lloyd Axworthy was the foreign minister, there was a push for no first use. But at that time, there weren't enough other NATO countries to support Canada. There's only Norway, I think. And then a couple of years later, Germany pushed it, Joschka Fischer, when he was the foreign minister, or defense minister, I think, not foreign minister, pushed no first use. But again,
didn't get anywhere.
It didn't get anywhere because there weren't enough countries supporting. There was no. Now we're getting more support with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly supporting no first use. If Canada took a push now, there are more parliamentarians within other European countries which could follow up and say, we've already discussed this and we support this. We've got OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So there's more potential for it to have an impact. Also, with regards to the US, there's now the start of resolutions in state parliaments supporting no first use. The first one was in California.
Okay. Now you're telling me something I don't know. California took a position of no first use.
Supporting no first use, yes. And the last
I'm an ex-Californian, so it grieves me to know I didn't know that.
And there are a number, I think 8 or 10 resolutions pending in other state legislatures to support no first use. Wow. And the new chair of the House of Representatives Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, yes, he is the one who's introduced the resolution in the House of Reps on no first use when he was the ranking member, and he's prepared to do it again. So at some stage, he'll be introducing a resolution on no first use, and he's now the chair of the Armed Services Committee. So there's more momentum, political momentum now, to be able to support a no first use initiative if Canada decided to take this forward.
By the way, you know, it was the Democrats under Obama that went along with this modernization thing. Now, I think it was a trade-off in order to get something else approved.
Yeah, the New START Treaty. Okay. Obama negotiated the New START Treaty.
But you know, is there any prospect of having enough strength within the Democratic House? I don't know whether that would work the Democratic House of Representatives to actually reverse this policy of modernization. Because
Well,
that
yes.
commitment is stupendously expensive and so stupid.
Yes. What they can do is that they can refuse to allocate the funds for specific aspects of the program.
How many of them would favor doing that? Because I think, historically, there's always been a question between the Republicans and the Democrats is who's bigger, who's bullier than, we are stronger militarily than you guys. And I think there are a lot of Democrats who just wouldn't want to be considered chicken enough to not spend the full hilt of, whatever they've got available on weapons. But maybe I'm being cynical because I'd love to see that happen. What do you think the odds are that there could be?
Well, I think there are political forces both ways. And the Democratic Party, there are a large number of members and they're not all the same. So, as I said, in the Senate, you've got Senator Markey and another 10 who are supporting cutting nuclear weapons budgets, stopping this modernization, stopping new weapon systems, but they're a minority in the Senate. In the House, I think there's a larger majority of Democrats who would swing in behind some of the initiatives to stop specific weapon systems. So, for example, one of the reasons Trump wants to withdraw from the INF Treaty is because his administration wants to build a new nuclear-tipped cruise missile, which would be in violation of the INF Treaty. The House could probably block that, and there's probably enough support from the House Democrats to stop that. Some of the other modernization, I don't know. Again, you've got different politics playing out. You've still got the corporations, who are funding Democrat campaigns, not just Republicans. They put money on both sides. I know some Democrats who are in congressional districts that have a lot of money coming in from the weapons corporations that are very hesitant to oppose budgets. But there are other ones who are opposed to this. So as I said, there will be more opportunity in the House to stop some weapon systems, but not to go as far as what we would like and stop modernization altogether.
No, there won't be a stop of modernization.
Not altogether, no. As I said, I think they'll stop certain weapon systems, but not the whole modernization program.
Okay. Well, I keep reading about how within the Democratic Party they're really divided, in terms of conventional people versus a bunch of newer, younger, radical types, Bernie Sanders types, that have more, look at things differently, the way you and I more. And I just wasn't sure whether or not that group of people, if they in fact are a group, if they think they have like a caucus or something, if they think of themselves as anti-militaristic, is there any segment of the House of Representatives who think of themselves as largely anti-militaristic or softer in social policy and foreign policy?
It's called the Progressive Caucus. And so the Progressive Caucus was there in previous administrations, but it wasn't a majority of the Democrats were part of the Progressive Caucus. I think the Progressive Caucus is going to have more influence in the new Congress.
Okay, fine. Well, now tell me more about what's happening in terms of European public opinion about nuclear weapons. How much support? Which way is the wind blowing on this issue in Europe in general? If you look at, for example, within the European Parliament, do they even discuss policies such as disarmament or NATO policy or anything of that kind? And do they have the right to talk about these things? And if so, what would you hear if you wandered the halls of in Brussels?
Okay, so there are a few aspects to this. Nuclear weapons themselves are not talked a lot about in the public discourse, in the media. Only rarely will you have if there's something like a specific nuclear weapons threat. So, for example, when Putin threatened nuclear weapons over Crimea, I mean, his threat was Crimea as part of Russia. If the West tries to oppose that and take it back, don't forget we've got nuclear weapons. People sort of paid attention there. Oh, nuclear weapons. But it didn't. That threat posture from Putin didn't really come into sort of like, oh dear, then we should get rid of the weapons in Europe. It was more like, oh, maybe we need to balance Putin's weapons with, you know, a strong deterrence in Europe, but we may have to make it a safe deterrence. So in Europe, the discourse is more like the majority discourse is that, well, yes, we need nuclear deterrence, but we shouldn't really have it as threatening. It should just be like, you know, deterrence. And so people here don't really support first use of nuclear weapons, for example. But that's the public level, and that's at the parliament level. The governments in NATO are still very hesitant to push to change NATO policy. And that's where maybe why Justin Trudeau is a little bit reluctant to push something, because while he would get support from some of the European parliaments for NATO to abandon first use and to have a no first use policy, there will be some of the NATO countries, the ones that are close to Russia, that might say, oh no, we need first use, because what happens if Russia sends, you know, their tanks across the border? Shouldn't we be able to threaten them with a nuclear retaliation? So that it would take political capital to achieve no first use with NATO. And that's probably the thinking in the Trudeau leadership of whether they should take this on or not. It wouldn't just be taking on the United States, it'd be taking on some of the other European countries.
Well, are there any European countries that would be likely to be persuaded or be joining with that kind of initiative? Well,
on no first use, as I mentioned, Germany and Norway have already in the past put forward no first use and tried to push it. And they are, you know, would be strong candidates to support Canada. Netherlands would also be a strong candidate to support Canada if Canada pushed no first use. They would be, I'm talking about the NATO countries because we're talking about changing NATO policy. So I think they would be the key ones to give support.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Now let's see. Tell me more about, the Basel Peace Office in general. Are you spending most of your time there? And do you work in Basel on PNND? Do you travel a lot? Do you give speeches? What is it you're doing?
Okay, so I mentioned we set up Basel Peace Office because it was well located for our network of parliamentarians. So we do a lot of work out of the Basel Peace Office on the parliamentary program. And not only are we close, as I said, to the United Nations in Geneva, close to the European Parliament in Brussels, and sometimes in Strasbourg and the European network, but also it's very close to the Interparliamentary Union. And the Interparliamentary Union is the World Association of Parliaments. It's not individual parliamentarians. The parliaments themselves are members. 178 parliaments, including Canada, including most of the nuclear armed states, the NATO states, other European countries, Russia, China, are members of the Interparliamentary Union. So it was the Interparliamentary Union that we worked with to get the Parliamentary Action Plan. Mm-hmm. We got discussions going, dialogue in their assemblies, a resolution adopted by the Interparliamentary Union. And that provides us a platform for working with the parliaments to take forward nuclear disarmament ideas. And they're based in Geneva. So we're in Geneva a lot with the Interparliamentary Union. Yeah. But we also have an office in Prague. And part of the idea of Prague, that came when President Obama gave his first foreign policy speech, major one, as president. It was in Prague. And it was the Prague speech for a vision and commitment to a nuclear weapons-free world. An incredible speech he gave in Prague.
It sounded, I think that's why he got the Nobel Prize, wasn't it? Because people thought he was serious. Well, I think it was. Joe Cirincione says he was serious, but they just didn't make it happen.
Yeah, and he was. We had once with his administration, we had open door, which we hadn't before. So we could go whenever we wanted to. We could go and meet with top US administration officials and talk about ideas, possibilities for nuclear disarmament, and how we could work with the US administration. And what happened in Prague was that every year after he gave his speech, there was an international conference where we would bring parliamentarians together, and the hosts, which were the Czech Foreign Ministry and the Institute for International Relations would bring in academics and diplomats, and we would have really good discussion about how to take forward the agenda. But unfortunately, Obama was a victim of the divided Congress in the United States and the Ukraine conflict. And the power of the corporations. It strapped him, it prevented him from moving forward. So, for example, when he negotiated the New START agreement with Russia, one of the first things he did coming into office, he took it to the US Senate to get ratified. The entire Republican caucus and some of the Democrats said, no, we're not going to ratify this new arms reduction agreement unless you spend more money on nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. Now, how ridiculous is that? For a treaty to get lower the numbers of nuclear weapons, you're told you have to spend more. But they said, we're not going to ratify it. And if that New START treaty had not been ratified, it would have just killed the rest of the agenda. No one else would do nuclear disarmament if the US and Russia are holding so many weapons, thousands and thousands, and doing nothing about them. So it was a prerequisite to any other form of disarmament was to get that New START deal. But he had to agree to modernization of nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the Senate would not have ratified. Then after that came the Ukraine conflict. Then, working with Russia got cut because of the dispute between US and Russia. So basically, he couldn't do anything more on the Russia-US nuclear weapons reductions. He tried doing unilateral reductions. He said, well, if we can't get any more agreements with Russia, we could just cut them ourselves. But the Congress said no. The Congress refused to allow him to do any unilateral reductions in nuclear weapons. So then he goes, well, what can I do? Maybe I can resolve the issue with Iran. So then he spent, his efforts to make sure that the Iran conflict didn't erupt into a Middle East war and got the JCPOA, the Iran deal, which now President Trump is throwing away. So through all this, as I said, we had open door to come into the administration and talk about ideas. For the humanitarian impact approach, this was something initiated by Switzerland and Norway and these 3 international conferences. Obama brought the United States into that process. A lot of his officials said, you shouldn't touch this. But he said, no.
They'd sent delegations?
Yep.
Officially? Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yep. Not to the first 2. Because they weren't able to talk with the host. The first host was Norway, and it was too soon. The second one was Mexico, and they couldn't get an agreement on Mexico about how the US could participate. But they went to the third one. That was hosted by Austria. And basically, it was indicating a US administration awareness of the horrific humanitarian impact of any use of nuclear weapons. And this was a commitment put in the Nuclear Posture Review, Obama's, that we have to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used. That was very strong in the Nuclear Posture Review. So I would agree with, was it Joe Cirincione, that the Obama administration was generally wanting to work on these issues, but got strapped in very many ways. They might have been able to do better, but they also were focused on healthcare and other efforts. And when they were trying things, the Congress was saying no. It was like now. So that's like the unfortunate thing of having a Democrat president with Republican Congress, is that Republican Congress can block progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned this INF treaty, the abrogation of that. Tell me, they claimed, the U.S. claimed that Russia had already been violating it. I don't know how much truth there is in that, but I wouldn't say that, from everything I've heard, I wouldn't have the opinion that Putin was a fervent supporter of the INF treaty anyway. Tell me what you think is going on there and what you expect the outcome to be. And is there are there any interventions that anybody could make that would stop the drift in that direction, where this is actually there would be a renewal of the nuclear arms race, I suppose, if they really junk the INF treaty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm not an expert on all the numbers and precise configurations of all the weapon systems, but what I do know is that there have been charges by both sides of violations of the INF treaty. It appears as though the Russian violations are more serious, but there also seems to be some substance to the Russian challenges about the United States. But I think part of the problem here is that they're attacking different things. From the Russian side, there is a lot of concern that the United States and NATO did not go along with the general agreement at the end of the Cold War, which was that Russia would dissolve the Warsaw Pact, and that from the United States, if they kept NATO, then they would keep NATO as it was. They wouldn't expand NATO closer to the Russian border. But NATO, and Gorbachev says that this was the agreement. It was just never written down in a treaty.
Yeah, that's one of his big mistakes. He didn't get it in writing.
Right. So then NATO moves closer and closer with more and more NATO states. And here Russia is feeling this is a violation of the agreement. There's not specifically a violation of the INF treaty, though. But what Russia is concerned is that, well, you also have nuclear weapons on US submarines that are, close to Russia, that are threatening them. And there's also US nuclear weapons deployed on European territory. And these are the ones that are hosted, the nuclear sharing.
Are those violations of the INF?
They're not violations of the INF treaty either. But what Russia is saying is that they are providing the West with the same capacity that they would have had if they'd had the missiles. Instead of the missiles, they have the free-fall bombs, which are deployed in these places, which are close to Russia and can be used to attack Russia. Mm. So Russia's complaints are not about specifically violations of the letter in the INF treaty, but about weapon systems and policies of the West that are threatening them in the same way as if they were violating the INF. Whereas Russia appears to be developing a missile that would be in violation of the INF. Mm. Now, there was a process in the INF to try and resolve these. The US says it's already appealed to Russia on this, but it appears that they haven't exhausted that process. And that's where a number of our parliamentarians are saying it would be best if the United States doesn't withdraw from the INF treaty, but uses the process within the INF treaty, the verification and challenge processes there to try and diplomacy issues to try and resolve these issues with Russia. Okay. The next thing is that it's quite likely that Trump will withdraw the United States from the INF. I mean, we've seen when he made the threat about withdrawing from the Iran agreement, he went ahead with that. Mm-hmm. So is there a way...
You have to give him that.
So if that happens, are there other things to do to ensure that we don't have a nuclear arms race in Europe and missiles coming back? And that's where the European countries, particularly those in NATO, can say, we will not permit, new weapon systems coming into Europe. Missiles, for example. They don't have to permit, they don't have to allow them. They're sovereign countries. Also, in the US Congress, the US Congress can refuse to fund any new weapon systems which might violate the INF treaty. So those are a couple of things that can be done even if Trump withdraws from the treaty.
Okay. Well, you've given me some homework to do. I don't think you assigned it to me exactly, but I've been making mental lists of things I have to work on now that I've talked to you about this. And I see that you've got your own agenda that's pretty busy. You keep pretty busy, don't you?
Yeah, we have a few things to do.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful to talk to you. Mm-hmm. And I think we've just about come to the end of our time. Once we patch these two things together, when they collapsed in the middle, we have to glue them back together. Mm-hmm. Anyway, really fun to talk to you as usual, Alyn, and I certainly wish you all kinds of good luck this year, and Happy New Year to you.
Thanks, Metta. And if anyone listening to your program is interested in getting updates, for example, we will be adopting a joint appeal of mayors and parliamentarians to protect the INF treaty and to support nuclear disarmament and sustainable security. Then they can always contact us at info@pnnd.org or on our website www.pnnd.org.
Good. And if you want us to put an ad or something in Peace Magazine to that effect,
yes, we can do that.
Send me a little thing and we'll find a way to promote it.
Okay. Thanks, Metta.
Wow. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.